Welcome to the Lead Defend podcast, a show designed to help you grow in faith and leadership as you navigate the stages of young adulthood. We address important faith topics and provide practical life tips, helping you build up your faith as you engage a changing culture. Now, here are your hosts.
Hey, this is Ryan and Brock, and today we're with Dr. J.J. Washington of North American Mission Board. And tell me, Dr. Washington, what does the doctor mean? You delivering babies or performing colonoscopies?
What kind of doctor is
What
this?
kind of doctor is this?
That's funny, man. I tell you, I'm still just laughing when I hear that because I'm just JJ, really. You know what I mean? But people teach me about Dr. J, you know, the basketball player and all that. But you can call me JJ, man.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you've been in a new position here recently. So you work for a group called the North American Mission Board, and you just help folks share the gospel. And I even see right here, you're sitting with us. You're about to preach to several hundred pastors from across the state, and you got a bracelet on just as an evangelism tool. And so tell me, why the passion for evangelism in your life?
Well, the gospel radically transformed me, and it's the power of God unto salvation. It's foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And so that's why I'm passionate about it. And so my whole thing, when I went to college, July 2001, going into my sophomore season, that's when I got saved. I played football at North Carolina State University.
Okay.
Originally from Stone Mountain, played high school football there, did well enough to get recruited. Actually got recruited by the Razorback.
Really? And you turned us down?
Yeah, man. It was Houston Nutt was just kind of
we love Nutt.
They had a little run. But went to South Carolina, Maryland, NC State, and I committed to NC State. Went there anyway.
What position?
I played corner.
Okay.
The little guys that bark but don't really want to bite. And we look like we want to hit, but we don't. So anyway, I went there. I tore my ACL during my sophomore season. So after I tore it, I had to have surgery, went through rehab. And then during that process, a teammate invited me to a Bible study on campus.
Wow.
I went, and mainly I was going to go and ask the pastor there that was leading the Bible study to pray for my knee, that it wouldn't re-tear. The new season was coming around, and I didn't want to re-injure it. So anyhow, I went at the conclusion of the Bible study, went up to the pastor, asked him if he would pray. He said, hey, let me just clear out the room, and then I'll come back and be glad to pray for you. So anyway, he walked back there. The first thing he said was, JJ, this is not about your knee.
Wow.
And then he asked me if I knew Jesus. And so if you would have asked me that, I would have said that I was a Christian. I never doubted Jesus, never had a problem, just didn't live for him, and I didn't know the gospel. And so I even had the cross chain, the jewelry. Those were in style. I had the tattoo on my arm, but he wasn't in my life. And so I told him, I said, sir, you know what? I don't know Jesus.
Wow.
And he asked me that I want to give my life to Christ. And so that was in July 2001. That night, I repented of my sins, placed my faith in Jesus, got connected with Athletes in Action, FCA, Campus Crusade, and those were, before I knew what discipleship was,
absolutely,
they were discipling me.
They were investing in you.
They were investing in me. And so within a year after that, I was involved with, the more of the serving end in those ministries and teaching and doing Bible studies and preaching on the campus. I was pretty much ignorance on fire at that time. I hadn't been to seminary yet, didn't know much about exegesis, hermeneutics, and all that. And so anyway, through that experience, man, I just felt called to ministry. Felt like God was calling me to ministry. So I finished up, got my degree, moved on.
Did you ever step back on the football field?
I did.
Okay.
I played 2 more seasons after that injury. And so kind of became, here's a funny story. So I used to have cornrows, right? Cornrows. And before Christ, they used to call me Lil Wayne because I'm little and I was a little wild,
that's awesome.
a little tight. And so after that, the movie Remember the Titans came out. And you remember Rev?
Uh-huh.
And so my nickname became Rev. That's what everybody...
Wow.
So that's what everybody used to call me on the football team, Rev. And so that's what they call me to this day. When I go back and I see some of the guys that played with me and we run into each other like, Rev, what's up, man? So anyway, to answer your question, that's why I'm passionate about it. The gospel radically changed my life.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
Yeah, one of the things that popped out to me in your story was you become connected to Christ just through a teammate who's willing to step out and speak up. I think there's a lot of students, even adults, who are listening to this podcast that man, they want to do that,
Right.
but there's something that's just holding them back. What do you see in students and adults as some of the main roadblocks, the main hurdles that keep them from sharing their faith, that keep them from making an invite to church?
That's a good question. I think the biggest one is fear.
Okay.
I mean, and even today, I mean, it's the culture is becoming less and less friendly to Christians. We see a lot of that happening. So sometimes it's the fear, it's the fear of rejection, it's the fear of being silenced or censored, all of that. And also, I think sometimes it's just competence that a lot of people just struggle with. Okay, how do I even get the conversation going?
Sure.
And then what do I say in the conversation, because I'm afraid that I might say the wrong thing, or I might not get it quite right, or I'm not as eloquent as my pastor, and he says it so beautifully, and I can't be him, or whatever the case may be. I think sometimes it comes down to that. And then sometimes I think it's on us as leaders in the church that we're not really creating that culture by, first of all, providing opportunities to train our folks consistently, just having it in the regular rhythms of our church calendar, where we're offering training on equipping on how to share the gospel. And then also just a culture of just prayer for the lost and just praying for lost people. A lot of times when I'm in churches, the prayer time is a transitional moment. It's not an intentional time of prayer for lost or anything like that. And so, and those are just some observations. And sometimes there's in some churches, there is not even an invitation to come to Christ after the sermon is preached. So I always ask myself, if I went to this church and I was lost, could I? There are churches I've been to since I've been working for Georgia Baptist in this role, because when I was a pastor, I just assumed that everybody did it.
Sure.
But I've gone to churches, and I thought about myself when I was lost. If I had gone to those churches when I was lost, I would have remained lost. There was no invitation to come and to the taste the bread of life.
Wow.
And so I think those things are critical for helping create that culture.
Yeah. So at NAM, what are some of the things that you guys suggest, tips you give, training you provide to help people overcome fear and overcome that feeling of maybe ignorance that they don't have the ability to eloquently share the gospel?
One thing I think we try to do with the fear piece is just pushing people to Jesus and being honest with the Lord. Lord, I'm afraid. I'm fearful in this situation. Could you help me, give me courage, give me boldness? And Paul
prayed for that.
He always prayed for it, And even when he was in Corinth, in Acts chapter 18, it says the Lord came to him and he had this vision. The Lord spoke to him and says, "Listen, don't be afraid, but speak."
Yeah.
And he talked about how many people in this city. And so even, Paul dealt with some of that. And sometimes we want, we forget that Paul was a human being, right? And so pray, ask God, and He'll come through. He'll bring you out of that place, because we want it to come from the overflow.
Sure.
It's just coming out of the overflow. And so that's one thing we just try to push people to Jesus. I think far as the tools piece, I mean, we have, you have your 3 circles, you have your best news, you have your live this. I mean, you can, and there's scores of things out there. There's 4 spiritual laws. That's what I was trained on when I was in college.
Evangelism Explosion.
Yeah, explosion. I mean, they're all out there, scores. So the problem is not necessarily tools, it's the heart.
Yeah.
And so we're just really trying to encourage people, man, walk closely with the Lord, abide in Jesus, and let it come out of the overflow of your intimacy with Him. And always be ready. And so those are some of the things. I think when it comes to the culture piece, what we're trying to do right now in the process of doing this, and we hope it'll come out around the annual meeting, and Shane and his team are working on it so it can be something that can be utilized in the youth ministries and college ministries and stuff like that. But it's a process, a pathway to creating that culture.
Wow.
So we're just trying to take the thinking out of it for pastors and just give them the playbook and say, here's the play, just run this play.
That's big. Now, one thing that was interesting to me about your story is you had this ACL tear, and all of a sudden that started the opportunity for people to engage you in spiritual conversation. Now, you may have been open to it outside of that,
right?
But that started the opportunity.
That did.
And there's sometimes when students that are going through life, they just have clear opportunities to share the gospel, whether it's tragedy in somebody's life or difficult situations. Can you help us? How does a person identify those open doors that God may put in front of them?
Man, that's a good question. I think when we're in relationship with people, and obviously Ray Robinson, the guy who invited me, was in relationship with me. He knew I was going through a tough time. Yeah. And he actually had invited me before, but I blew him off. I wasn't interested. I was just doing me. And but he circled back. And he asked me, and I was in that moment dealing with that tragedy. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
So I think when you see that, when people are going through something in their life, and you hear friends share something with you, man, that's an open door. And I think being transparent, for example, if someone comes to you and say, man, I just heard my mom and dad are getting a divorce, and I really don't know what to do. And you can say, you know what, man, we live in a real broken world. Mm-hmm. And I've gone through things in my own life that have been very challenging. And what I do is I pray. I just talk to God about it. I mean, have you ever considered that? Have you ever talked to God about it? I don't really know if I don't, what do you mean by that? And then boom, you just go right to the gospel. And so you just try to listen for those opening doors, and so tragedy can be one of those things as well. It could be things where good things happen, man. It may some come. I just got an offer from such and such. Man, that's awesome, man. Ain't the Lord good, man? I mean, he's so kind to us.
Wow.
And then boom, you just go. So you just always try to just be ready and listen for the open door, and when the door opens, go walk right there.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it wasn't the first time that your friend invited you when you said yes. Mm-hmm. So speak a minute on, I think a lot of times when we think about sharing the gospel, maybe it's going out and making a cold call, which is appropriate. It's needed at times. But speak a little bit to earning like that right to be in people's lives, about sharing how to deal with rejection. How was it important to you that he was a part of your life before and he didn't just kind of show up in the middle of the tragedy?
Yeah, that's huge. Because there was some trust there, and just a mutual appreciation for each other, and so that's huge because people are usually more receptive when they hear it from someone that they've they've watched and observed and they've done life with. We were teammates, so we cried together, sweat together, win together, lost together. I mean, so we went through some things together. And so I think that is huge, man. I would just say that the most important thing, I think, is for us to build relationships with people that are lost. And it's going to be uncomfortable at times. Yeah. Because you're going to hear some things. They're going to say some things. Listen, they haven't been sanitized. They don't know the Lord yet. They haven't been sanctified, right? So the Lord sanctifies us after we come to Christ. And so you got to be comfortable in those type of situations. And no, man, when I'm around lost people, man, this is exactly where the Lord wants me to be right here. Wow. I'm here to be a light for the gospel. And they'll notice that you don't say those things, you don't talk that way, you don't enter. And sometimes they'll ask you, and that's an open door. Man, why did you don't do that? What's why? I've noticed this about, and so again, it's just a lot of ways to kind of get to the gospel.
JJ, your passion as a parent, you went from being known as Lil Wayne on the football team to being known as Rev on the football team. And so in your own life, because I think we have a lot of folks who listen to this that they're saying, man, I'm still known as the Lil Wayne. Like, I mean, I've trusted Jesus, but there's still people still know me as these what I was before. Yeah. So how did you make that transition with people in your relationships on the team?
You know what? It was literally like a light bulb when I after I got saved in July 2001, my mom bought me a Bible. I started reading it, and I just started devouring that thing, just reading, and then I found a local church and got involved in church, and then I said, well, man, I want to serve, and then they put me on the cameras, so I had to record, and I was a communications major.
Yep.
And so I had to be there on Sunday morning, Sunday night, went midweek. And so I was always there. And I even remember a lot of times those sermons, man, I just felt the Lord speaking to me as I'm recording. I'll be crying sometimes, trying to make sure I don't mess up the shot. But the Lord was dealing with me. And he was calling me out of stuff.
Wow.
You know what I mean? And so that holiness is important, that practical holiness, and living the life that Jesus has called us to live, and it gives us credibility with the lost when we do open our mouth. So that is important. That's an important piece.
Wow. That's big. There's something that shifted in our culture, and maybe it hasn't shifted, we're just more aware of it. But a lot of studies and reports are saying that even Christians, people who claim to be Christians, are more hesitant with the term evangelism. Yep. They're more hesitant with the term conversion. And so give us a defense. Like, should we be hesitant about evangelism? Should we change our definitions? What do we do with that?
That's a good question, because I remember, I think it was a Barna report that came out. You guys might remember this, but I think it said like 40-some% of millennials.
It was close to half.
Something that said it was wrong to
sharing your personal views is wrong.
Yeah. And I think it was another one that said like 51% of the church doesn't even know they're not familiar with the term Great Commission.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think as leaders, what we have to do, and I'm glad you brought this up, is we really have to drill down the why.
Wow.
I know we all, we're like the coach, here's what we're going to do, but sometimes we assume that they know why. But we need to take that time to really unpack that. We're a new creation.
Yeah.
We're ambassadors for Christ. This is our identity, right? Just laying that down and allowing that to take root in the hearts. And then when you come into, okay, here's what we're going to do, the mission, and here's the how we're going to do it, the tool, 3-circle, whatever, pick one. That's a little bit more holistic. But a lot of times we're just jumping right to how. We're not even telling what, we're not even telling why, and I think that's what creates what we see now, where a lot of people don't even know what Great Commission means, and they think it's wrong.
Do you think that's a culture issue, or is it a pulpit issue?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a pulpit issue.
Okay.
I think that we got to teach the whole counsel of God.
Yeah.
And help people to see the mission of God, and understand that God has now given us that we are the church custodians of the gospel. And that God has called us to make known the gospel. And so I think that is part of it, just that teaching. And then I think it's a cultural issue as well, too. And sometimes it's just that it's not a priority.
Yeah.
It's not. It's evangelism is usually the first thing to fall off the table in the church, in the life of a church. And we see scores of churches that have baptized 1 or 0. Yeah. And we're trying to figure out how we can help them turn that around.
Wow. That's huge.
Do you think that's connected with, I feel like, so I've recently moved from a middle school position to now I'm a campus pastor. I'm preaching to adults weekly. Okay. And probably over the last 20 years, we've seen a shift in language about hell, about eternal punishment. Do you think there's a connection between the maybe de-emphasizing of the afterlife, of hell if you don't believe in Jesus, and the necessity to evangelize? Because if you don't have this punishment, you lose urgency. Do you think?
That's exactly, man. That's good. You're right. It definitely that the whole truth. Yeah. I mean, and if we do believe hell to be a real place and that people go there if they don't repent and believe the gospel, then there will be that urgency. Yeah. And lost people will be on our mind. And when we're meeting people, that's usually what's popping up in my mind. When I meet somebody, I'm thinking, man, does he know the Lord? You know what I mean? And because you don't want them to perish. Yeah. And I think you're right on with what you just said. If that is not taught, and if that is diminished, then we fall into apathy.
It's almost like we've numbed ourselves or desensitized to the weight of what happens to a person. Because a lot of times at a funeral, even of a non-believer, we think of like, oh, well, they're in a better place. Yes. But if they're not a Christian, they aren't. Yes, exactly. They aren't in a better place. So let's say someone's listening, they're convinced, they need to be more engaged. Do they need to go out and buy every single evangelism tool and have their, Batman's utility belt of evangelistic training? Or do you think it's better to just kind of focus on one thing, keep it simple? Is it better to have like a lot of options?
Man, I think
what's the next step?
I think keeping it simple as possible is the key. I know pastors that teach a lot of different tools for their church. They want to give them, and that's fine. And I know others that just say, okay, here's our tool. This is the tool we're going to use to train our folks on. And they just kind of, that's the tool they utilize to equip their folks. But I think the first step, if a person right now is just cold right now, they haven't shared, I think to be going, just starting over with, going to the Lord about that. Say, Lord, I realize this. I know I'm supposed to be doing this, and just repent and ask God to help you, give you courage, give you boldness, and then to begin praying for lost people in your lives that are lost, and then begin in making some intentional steps to share the gospel with them. And you can even go to them and say, listen, I should have had this conversation with you a long time ago. Wow. Yeah. And I apologize that I haven't. And just fall on the sword. Wow. And then just go right into the conversation. So that's the way to do it. And sometimes I even say this to people. Hey, do you mind if I ask you a question? Now, it's about Jesus, so I understand if you don't want to talk about him. I'll respect that. Yeah. I don't want to play games. I mean, if that's something that you don't want to do, I'll respect that. I'll wait on God's timing to have that conversation. I'm usually just trying to see if something's happening in the heart there. And I've had people say, no, you're fine. Go ahead. And then boom. And if they ever get to a place in the conversation where it gets contentious or something like that, I say, hey man, you remember you said we could have this conversation?
Yeah.
But you bump the brakes. But it's okay sometimes just to ask for permission.
Yeah.
JJ, you've got an incredible position, opportunity. You get to travel around, speak to churches, pastors, encourage them to put evangelism at the front. But what would you say to a student, whether it's a high school student, a college student, who may think, man, you're right, I probably do need to do evangelism, but I'm going to wait for that. Yeah. Why is this season of their life so critical to get the good news of Jesus to their friends and family? Man, I found that the older some folks get, the harder it becomes. Wow.
And a lot of times when you're doing life, I got saved in college. You know what I mean? I was really low-hanging fruit. You know what I mean? And so... And man, the light bulb just went off, and I think a lot of times when dealing with youth and stuff like that, and a lot of these guys are searching and trying to figure out make sense of life, and they're seeing things, hearing things, whatever. Man, they're just ripe.
Wow,
they're ripe, and a guy like me, I can't get to him. I can't go into the school. I'm done with school, right? So, but you're there, you're on the team, you're in the locker room. You're doing life together. And I think about this. When I was back at NC State, and I didn't know this, a guy was named Merritt Long. He worked for FCA. And he would kind of like, you need to go talk to Coach Amato now about Jesus. You need to go get. He was because I was in the locker room. Merritt couldn't get in the locker room.
Yep.
So he saw, hey, I'm going to ride this wave with JJ because he's right there with the guys. And I thought about that when I became an adult. I was like, Merritt was smart, man. I know what he was doing now. He didn't let me in on it, but I know what he was doing. He was trying to basically. I was there. I was with the guys. And they're with the guys.
Yeah.
These young folks.
You had
with
that
the
relationship.
Guys. Yeah, they had the relationships. And so anyway.
Yeah, and there's just opening your eyes to who's around you. I didn't realize until I was after high school that, man, God had put me with the same people every day for years.
Yeah.
Those relationships don't exist beyond that.
Yeah.
And so I would just say this to a young person listening, like, man, you got an opportunity in the closeness of relationship right now that you can speak into somebody's life and it matter more than it will later.
And if you're in high school or college, you have an opportunity like you probably won't have for the rest of your life because of the people you're around, the sports that you're playing, the classes that you're going to. The fact that you're single, like you may not ever have a freedom to be able to connect. I was at a D-Now this weekend, got to speak, and the youth pastor had a student give their testimony before each service.
Wow.
And this young lady just got up and gave a powerful testimony. And I texted the student pastor and I said, give the invitation now. I was like, don't wait for me, do it now. Because like the students were captivated. She had that relationship with them. So in all your experience, I think a lot of people, maybe one of those things holding them back too is the response that they're going to get.
Yeah.
What's the average response that you get from people when you're sharing the gospel or inviting to church?
I get a lot of no's.
Yeah.
I do. I get some green lights too though.
Yeah.
And I get some maybes. And those are always awesome, man, and here's what I say. And the power is not in our speaking ability.
Wow.
It's not in that. The power is the Holy Spirit working upon the hearts of those that we are sharing with. Yeah. And so listen, don't let that be a hindrance. Like Jeremiah said, man, I'm only a youth.
Yeah.
I can't do this, God. Remember that? No. God put his word in his mouth and said, you go speak. And he did, and God did a work. And so I just would encourage them in that way that, don't feel like you got to be like your pastor, your youth pastor. You got to, just be you and just share the good news.
Yeah.
Wow. From Lil Wayne to the Rev. I love it, man. JJ, I'm just trusting that God's doing big things in your life, and he's going to use you even this conference. JJ's about to preach, even after he gets off this podcast, to, I don't know, there's probably 700 guys in that room.
And the podcast title, can we honestly say that we had Lil Wayne on the podcast? Like, dude, listenerships would go up, comments would go down.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I don't want to get sued by Lil Wayne's people, so... It'll be good. Well, hey, appreciate you so much. And remember, Lead Defend's just around the corner. So you go to leaddefend.org to find out more information about the conference that's coming up. Can't wait to see you there.
That's it for this episode of Lead Defend. To hear more episodes from the Lead Defend crew, visit absc.org/podcasts. If you liked what you heard, rate and review us on your favorite podcast listening site. Want to learn more information about the next Lead Defend conference? Visit leaddefend.org.